As this first slide states, this is Craig Lane with Health Alchemy. As this first slide states, are you caught in a web of confusion? And as this child, and this is a multifaceted slide, in that what we're looking at here is this is what the child is actually undergoing when they're born. Our gut is sterile when we're born, and then we take on, as we head out of the womb, we head through the vaginal canal. The mother's bacteria and yeast and microbes that live in the vaginal canal end up on the skin. And what I've been finding out more recently is that, wow, what ends up happening is children end up being, in the more enlightened hospitals these days, they end up getting inoculated with these microbes, which is kind of cool, right? So they put it all over their skin because if they're having a cesarean section or the mother has poor flora, they might have a stock of microorganisms that go into the child's body that rub it all over, especially if there's a cesarean birth, because there's no, and then the child obviously needs the inner inoculation too. So we have microbes on here and microbes all over our body. And in next week's PowerPoint and the following, because I'll be expanding on this, my latest newsletter speaks to this, in that we're basically in a microbial soup. We're like a little bit human, maybe 1 to 10% human as far as the numbers go, and in terms of actual DNA in our body. Is what they're discovering more and more through the Human Microbiome Project. And it's something I've been suspecting for a long time, and it's really pleasing to me to see the data and the research throwing us back to some things that many of us have been thinking about for a long time. In other words, there's been a whole school of thought in Chinese medicine for thousands of years where all they did was treat the gut for any illness. So I was giving a nutrition talk with Dr. Sawyers down here in the office, a basic nutrition talk, and one of the guys came up and we were talking about digestion and detoxification, and he said, well, I don't have any digestive problems. And then what's interesting there is, like, I said, well, then why are we talking? You know, why? And so he basically ate a bowl of Cheerios every morning with pasteurized milk. And then I said, well, what is your symptoms? And he says, well, I have some heart issues and bypasses and high cholesterol, high triglycerides, blah, blah, blah. And then I said, well, there's your digestive problem right there. And you could see this little light bulb go on inside him. And in my men's work, we look for a truth response. And that was a definite, like, the light in his eyes went on, and it's like, oh, a truth response. So here we are. And he's following up because he's intrigued that maybe we can do some things. And he may not be comfortable. A lot of people that don't have digestive problems, they in iridology, we see the connections of the brain to the gut. And if we see a lot of dark areas in what we call the autonomic nerve wreath, then we know that they're likely to be numb. So I palpate the gut. So if somebody comes in and we palpate their gut and it shows they don't feel anything, then chances are they're numb. In other words, it's disturbing to me sometimes. I go, well, you're not feeling any pain at all, huh? But there should be obvious pain. So get out of the web of confusion and take action is what I suggest, as I had to many, many years ago, over 20 years ago. Well, actually 27 years ago, I broke my neck in a car accident. I knew I had to take action, but I knew that there was a web of deceit and lies out there in the medical system. So I began to just plod along as best I could, and it wasn't comfortable, but I'm just grateful now that I can help others where I could not have been helped and wasted a lot of time in my own judgment. So small intestine cleanse, slide number 2. One thing I'd ask everyone to look at is these are some rhetorical questions, and that you write down your goals. What do you want out of a cleanse? Why are you cleansing? Is it because someone told you to, or is it because you think you should? I mean, when you look at something like a cleaner window, or yourself after a shower, or a car after it's been tuned up, how does it work better? And one of the things that came up for me was self-responsibility. I held myself back for a lot of years because there was a small part of me that was invested in staying small, blaming others, blaming microbes for my illnesses, blaming the system, being angry. And it took some sheer acts of will to sort of just throw myself into some situations. And in the work of, or fact or fiction, whether Carlos Castaneda and his teacher Don Juan, those stories were true or not, I love the analogy of Don Juan in Dream, which at the time Carlos didn't know it was in a dream, but he would ask him to jump off a cliff at various points in the series of books. And that's a leap of faith, jumping off the cliff, and then you find yourself midair, as I have many times in my life. And it's like, oh boy, how am I going to get out of this? And it's sort of a interesting place to be. But that's where that will to jump and the courage, and we talked a bit about that at the group yesterday, the courage to move forward despite not knowing. And then we'll be talking more about the three centers, the mind. We can be awake in the mind. As I see so many people in my practice, they're awake upstairs, but then on the emotional level, on the heart, there's some shadow operating, and then down in the gut, or the existential things, just existence itself, panic attacks and anxiety and things that's where the microbes that are, they're running the show, and the emotions are really there. I had a new client over the weekend. That's one of the things we were talking about was anxiety, So one of the reasons why I cleansed was I wanted to be more. I was interested in the truth more than I was the lies, and stepping into a larger version of myself. Slide 3, when we look at the Chinese medical system, which is similar to a lot of traditions, what I like about Chinese medicine is the use of how, you can see on the chart here on page 3, is that different elements feed other elements. And it's nice they don't have the elements on this particular chart, which I think it makes it less conceptual. But like, it's obvious that anger, which is part of the wood element, feeds fire, which is at the top, sadness and joy. And the fire of the sun feeds the earth, which feeds plants and fruits and grains and animals, and that's the one on the right, worry and sympathy. And then as the plants land to the earth and decay, they turn to ash, or if they're burned, or minerals, and they turn into metal. And that's the point where in the Chinese medical tradition, I believe in the macrobiotics, I would look at it more as the extreme contraction of something. The fruit is ripened and it's fallen, and now it's decaying and rotting, and there's a need to let go, which is part of grief. And then metal, or the minerals, goes back to the next cycle, which is water. And then water feeds the wood so the plants can grow. And then you'll see these little arrows, the little star in the middle, which is fascinating because that's like the 5-petaled rose. And the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons and some of the earlier versions, but potentially of the Freemasons, the Knights Templar, had a lot of 5-pointed things. Interesting to say the least. So this cleanses the heart and the small intestine, and some of the emotions associated with that are sadness and joy. And if we don't acknowledge our sadness, that can turn to despair. But I believe that the ability to feel sadness allows us to feel joy, and the ability to let go allows us to move on, of course, to greater things. So we need to let go of the dwellers in our apartment complexes, i.e. in our gut, and that's one of the things we're jumping into with this cleanse. Next slide. Slide 4 is in the fire element. We talk about the heart mind in Chinese medicine. And it's just really interesting to note that when there's mucus in the heart channel, there's every text I could find. They talk about abnormal behavior and the clouding of the spirit and various neurological conditions, even epilepsy and seizures and obsessions and lack of a good sense. So this mucus obstruction comes back to when we eat foods we cannot digest, there turns into this waste. And when waste putrefies or ferments, then their acids are formed, and our body produces mucus to block the tissues around the gut from becoming too acidic. As you can see on the bottom there, that's a cycle of biofilm, unhealthy biofilm on the gut growing, which we'll spend a little bit later talking about. So really it's important to understand that this pole of enlightenment depends on the bottom pole, which is the gut. And then the middle pole is the blood, and the pumping the blood, and the heart pumping the blood, and the respiratory system purifying the blood and letting go with our breath so that this can stay clear to move on to the next thought or the next sensation. And it gets so convoluted. There's a point where you just have to let go of this and just learn to feel more. And that's what we're doing in these cleanses, is we're actually learning to feel more. Slide 5 is a further deepening of abnormal flora as the unclear mind. We'll have some more pictures later on, or diagrams of the intestinal villi, this is a rough approximation, but there needs to be mucus covering these cells. Just like if there wasn't mucus covering the stomach lining, then as the acid would be produced, the stomach would actually digest itself. So there are cells that produce mucus and there are cells that produce acid. And the genius of the body is at just the right time and in just the right amounts, the acid is produced to digest the stuff inside of this chamber, right, that is surrounded by mucus protecting the stomach and the gut itself. And you've got just this miracle. Think about it. You stuck your finger in your stomach, it would get really uncomfortable and maybe dissolve it because the acid's so low, the pH. The acid's so high, excuse me, the pH is low. And yet the tissue around it, you've got this pH in your stomach. So let's pretend this is your stomach and this is all the stuff around it, the lungs and the livers and all the other things around it. And that's maintained at a normal, the blood around that's still a normal 7.35, 7.45 pH. So you have a gradient, a very high acid and then a very normal neutral pH. And that gradient is often called the alkaline tide, where the acids all in the stomach and the rest of the body will turn just a tiny bit more alkaline. And that's why some people feel uncomfortable after they eat, and that's why others feel more comfortable after they eat. It's interesting. So the biofilm's a normal coating, and what we see there's the sadness and the joy again, is really seeing the sadness. For me, was about sitting in the sadness of how we've been educated, how we've been trained, how we've been conditioned to be powerless in the face of illness and things. And there was a large school of thought many, many years ago that Pasteur was part of, and Pasteur lamented on his deathbed, but we weren't taught that microbes don't rule, the terrain rules. And if you've ever been into plants and seen what a plant does in unhealthy soil versus a plant in healthy soil, it's amazing to see why some people get sick, why some people have flies buzzing around them and the person next to them doesn't, why some people have the same conditions and the other person next to them doesn't have trouble. And that's the terrain. They haven't attracted the illness to themselves. And as my teacher once said, don't take my word for it, go see for yourself. Because I used to get sick a lot. I got sick a lot, and no, I don't get sick. Knock on wood. I did get sick a few months back. There was a pretty harsh thing going around the community, and fortunately, my exposure level is fairly high, and I did fairly well. I wasn't out of work or anything like that. But my exposures come from doing stupid things like riding my bike too fast and surfing too much, and so that's how I break myself down and get exposed to illness. Next slide, slide 6. Here's the tennis court of surface, and these are different diagrams of the villi and the intestines. And the two at the bottom left are the ones that really we had a lot of fun with, and that those are one cell. One cell, if you look at the lining of the gut, is one cell thick. So these cells, you see the unhappy and the happy guy. And our ability to digest is enhanced by having a good afro, because each of those little afro hairs has thousands of little bubbles that are, conceptually illustrated here as digestive enzymes. And you can see that that guy on the left can digest about 3,000 times more food than the guy on the right. Right? He's bald, and he's got like a couple of digestive enzymes there. And so what the Chinese call weak spleen qi, what I translate that is weak digestive capacity and weak flora. So, the spleen in Chinese medicine is viewed as a lot of little things, but it could be viewed as your pancreatic ability, because there's enzymes squirted out from the pancreas and there's bile squirted out of the liver. But it's all catalyzed in these villi in the gut lining. So the small intestine is paired with the heart. And we're not going to go into all the concepts of Chinese medicine, but we're going to more in the physiology and how things feel. So when you feel off up here and you feel tired after meals or you get sick a lot, then you can bet downstairs there's some not so good things happening. And the other interesting thing to notice on the slide on the right, that's where gut cells are born and they're sloughed off. So 25 to 50% of our stool, somewhere, I'm not using large approximations here, is these dead cells getting sloughed off while the new ones are constantly being renewed. And they need to be renewed constantly because we don't want leaky gut. And lastly, there's the girls standing on top of the earth with the flower and the vast root network underneath her. And plants and humans are reversed. If you want to learn more about this, look at my video blog on plants and humans are kind of polar opposite. And that's a great exploration right there of, wow, we have this uncanny ability and synergy with plants to see. People like me have seen this for a long time, that, oh wow, plants and humans actually reversed. The plant roots, which is actually the brain, because those little rootlets you see down there are communicating with each other in some strange way, just like the large biofilm in our gut. It communicates. So what's going on at the top of the intestine is the stuff guys on the critters on the bottom know what's going on, and that's called our. And then our body knows what's going on via the enteric nervous system. So I'm really simplifying this to try to get through all this in time, because I have a lot to say in the next couple of slides here. So then the plant's sex organs are at the top. So the human brain's at the top, plant brain at the bottom down in the soil. Then the plant's sex organs are inverted. They're at the top. The flowers is how they reproduce. And the human sex organs are at the bottom. Plants produce carbon dioxide, humans produce carbon dioxide, which is their waste. Plants breathe that in, and they exhale oxygen, which humans use. Quite fascinating. Next slide. Slide 7 kind of gives you some samples of, a few of these slides are actual stuff that's come out of different people, and including myself, during cleanses. And you'll see these biofilms are actually how, like a worm there on the right, on the left, that's a tapeworm. That's how they live. They live within these coatings, these slimy little like space capsules, and that keeps them, the immune system away from them. And that one that says this could be inside you right now, most of us have some version of that if we're sick. And in the upper right there, you'll see that's either a worm or a candida. I believe it was a long worm that part of it got sloughed off and digested through, this person was taking digestive enzymes and antifungals and antiparasitics, and we were doing enemas with coffee and iodine and parasite herbs, so we're getting them from both ends, and then there's nowhere to hide at that point. If you're slamming stuff down this end and putting stuff up your butt, then the critters, they're trying to find their way around, and they're actually, what's more insidious is there actually are small critters that can burrow through the gut and end up in the lungs and stuff like that, and that's where we really got some problems. And if you don't believe me, then check out Morgellons disease, Morgellons. That's some variation on this, I believe. There's Morgellons, these freak show things coming out of people's body, I believe, are microorganisms that have overgrown in the human body. Slide 8. So there's the cleanse, getting ready for. So the theme, and there will be instructions sent to you if you're doing this online, or if you're part of the cleanse, then you've already had this read to you, and we're just going a bit deeper now, just a review. So week 1, the theme is to clear out the sludge. So if you have a house that's dirty, and then there's going to be lots of like rotting food and people walking about and microorganisms and mold spores in the air, then the analogy is we want to clear all that out so that we can see more clearly. So we want to clear and detoxify in week 1. And then once we get that done, then we want to clear out the pathogens or the apartment dwellers or the people that are in the house that are causing problems. So we do our best to clear them out. And then week 3 is we start, once all that's out, then we can start to rebuild and repopulate. Rebuild the building, rebuild the flora, rebuild the intestinal lining, and then add in more helpful apartment dwellers. The sword there, the image of the sword and the deity is Manjushri, and that's the slicing away of illusion, the sword of truth. Letting go is another version of this, and it can be painful, right? The blade is something that's been with me a lot in my life. Images of being sliced by a blade or beheaded, and who knows if it's past life, or who knows if it's just this constant urging to move more and more into truth for myself. But that's why that's there, is we need to let go and slice off the old so that the new can grow again. The focus foods, there's a list sent to you that's a large list of basic foods. The focus foods for the summer are bitters, and if you have a lot of loose bowels, then we negotiate that and do a little less of extreme bitters, and some of those there are listed. And we also want water rich, because most of the country is in a lot of heat. I know I, for one, don't do well with a lot of cooked food in the summer. I used to have it because I couldn't digest, but that's where you can do juices with protein, such as ground up chia seeds. That's a fantastic cleansing drink that one could live on. You could do a different juice every day and have that be one of your meals, and then you could have some raw salads and with a nice protein-rich dressing. You could have smoothies, and you could have soups for dinner, And then on the rest days, I suggest very low protein and fat. Those are the days where your body can really cleanse and detox. And then the sacrifice is when you got to work, then you got to add in the protein and the fat. And I strongly suggest, since most Americans overdo carbohydrates, that you leave the legumes, the grains, and the carbohydrates out as much as possible. And if you do better, if you're a metabolic type or a type of person that does better with carbohydrates, then maybe you want to do some ferments with those carbohydrates and live on the protein, because when carbohydrates are fermented, then microorganisms eat them and they flourish, and then the microorganisms themselves become a form of protein. Quite fascinating also. That wasn't talked about in the group, but that's for you people here online, for those watching it. Slide 11. Easy to digest and prebiotic foods are definitely chia and flax seeds. That slime that they become when you pour boiling water over them is a great fiber for microorganisms to live in, especially, we want to encourage the good ones. Whey liquid or powder, that's straining the whey through a cheesecloth or a really nice fine sheet. Sterilized towel, old socks, things that are just sterilized, obviously. And then whey powder is nice too. And we are allowing a plain yogurt, plain kefir would be preferable. We are allowing lots of sauerkrauts and different fermented beverages and fermented fruits and nut paste and miso and yogurt and kefir cheeses as listed there how to make. And there's a recipe that is provided there, real basic recipe. I love the one with strained yogurt or kefir cheese, save the whey, and then adding salt and Italian herbs and garlic. Yum, so good. Fruit is okay. If you suspect yeast, then you should probably avoid fruit. There's some spices we want to focus on for the cleanse. There's some herbs that everyone's going to have something different. There are certain goodies allowed listed here. Highly recommended to have something that you look forward to every day, even if it's just a little bit, unless you want to be like me, a little bit extreme. And then more to come next week. Spread your wings and fly. Stay in touch. Communicate with each other if you're doing this in a group, especially if we're going to be trying to get some of these more in corporate groups. And really enjoy yourselves, because health should be fun. And as I was telling the group yesterday, if you absolutely have to indulge, then have a steak with some vegetables and lots of butter or coconut oil. That's going to be a much healthier indulgence for most people versus a Cinnabon or 3 slices of bread. Lentil soup would be a good indulgence, or even some mashed potatoes with butter. But I wouldn't go to the extreme refined convenience foods. That's a horrible way to indulge. That's what I've always taught myself to do is, okay, I'm craving something, so define the attributes. So if I'm craving a Snickers bar, well, it's creamy, crunchy, a little bit salty, chocolatey, and find something that would work in lieu of that, like maybe making some carob paste and spreading that on some toast, would be the next best thing. You just find ways around that and really enjoy